The alarm shattered the morning routine like a hammer through glass, and Jiwon bolted awake in his quarters with his heart already racing before his mind fully understood why. The emergency klaxon was different from the standard drills, deeper and more urgent, a sound that spoke of real danger rather than training exercises. Through the walls, he heard other cadets shouting questions and confusion spreading like wildfire through the dormitory sections. He was dressed and moving toward the briefing hall before the intercom announcement began, his body responding to instincts honed by weeks of training under Instructor Rallis. Other cadets filled the hallways, a river of beings from 90 species all flowing in the same direction. Keltar appeared beside him, the Drax moving with the same predatory grace that Jiwon had been teaching him to channel into combat effectiveness. They did not speak, but the companionship was there, built slowly over the past weeks through shared training sessions and mutual respect earned one lesson at a time. The briefing hall was chaos when they arrived. Holographic displays covered every wall, showing star charts and tactical readouts and data streams that updated faster than Jiwon could follow. Instructor Rallis stood at the center podium with other senior officers, her face grim in a way that made Jiwon's stomach clench with dread. The noise of hundreds of cadets fell to silence as a figure appeared on the main display, a being with features that marked him as one of the Union's highest-ranking admirals. 3 hours ago, the admiral began without preamble, we lost contact with the colony on Theta Carinae 7th. Initial telemetry suggested a communications failure. We dispatched a reconnaissance drone to investigate. What it found changes everything. The display shifted, showing footage from the drone's sensors. Jiwon leaned forward, his eyes trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Space was full of ships, but not Union vessels. These were different, angular and aggressive, covered in armor plating that seemed designed to intimidate as much as protect. They moved through the system like a swarm of predators, and even through the cold video feed, Jiwon felt a primal recognition in his hindbrain that whispered danger. The drone moved closer to the colony world, and the image quality improved, showing details that made several cadets gasp in horror. The colony was burning. Structures that had housed 10,000 beings were now rubble and flame. But worse than the destruction was what Jiwon could see moving through the ruins. Creatures that looked like they had crawled out of evolutionary nightmare. They were massive and covered in natural armor, with limbs that ended in claws designed for rending and tearing. They moved with horrifying speed and purpose, and when the drone's camera caught one looking directly at it, Jiwon saw intelligence in those eyes, cold and calculating and utterly merciless. The Yoth, the Admiral said, and his voice carried the weight of 3,000 years of history and 200 billion deaths. They have returned. The briefing hall erupted in panic. Cadets cried out in fear. Instructors shouted for calm, and the noise level became deafening. Jiwon sat frozen, watching as the creatures on the display destroyed what remained of the colony with brutal efficiency. The drone tried to retreat, but one of the Yoth ships targeted it with weapons that moved too fast to track. The feed went black. Silence! Rallis roared, her voice cutting through the chaos with the authority of someone who had commanded troops in actual combat. The room quieted, though Jiwon could still hear the sound of frightened breathing from every direction. The situation is grave, Rallis continued. Union Fleet Command is mobilizing every available ship. The Academy has been ordered to deploy all graduating cadets as emergency reinforcements. I will not lie to you. This is unprecedented and dangerous. You were meant to have 6 more months of training. That time is gone. Jiwon raised his hand and Rallis acknowledged him with a nod. How many ships came through? He asked. The drone counted 400 before it was destroyed, Rallis answered. We believe there are more. 400 warships. Jiwon tried to imagine that scale of force and failed. The Union had won the last war against the Yoth, but barely, and that conflict had consumed entire generations. If the Yoth had rebuilt their fleet in secret and were now launching a coordinated assault, the situation was worse than grave. It was potentially apocalyptic. I volunteer to deploy immediately, Jiwon said, standing up. Around him, other cadets looked at him with mixed expressions of fear and confusion. Some had started training with him, learning the Predator's way of combat, but most still saw him as the dangerous human who had made the gate go red. Right now, that did not matter. What mattered was that people were dying, and he had skills that might save them. Keltar stood beside him. I volunteer as well. Pris and Pross chimed together, their crystalline bodies resonating with determination. We volunteer. Bess floated up from her seat. her gaseous form swirling with agitation inside her containment suit. Volunteering also. More cadets rose one after another until nearly half the room was standing. Jiwon felt a surge of pride for these beings who were choosing to face their greatest nightmare, because it was the right thing to do. Rallis looked at them all with an expression that held both sorrow and fierce approval. "Your courage honors you," she said. "Report to the deployment bay in 1 hour. Draw combat equipment and board your assigned vessels. May the stars guide you home." The briefing ended and cadets scattered to prepare. Jiwon made it 3 steps toward the exit before his communication implant activated with a priority signal. The encryption code was one he recognized instantly. Earth military, highest security clearance. He ducked into an empty side corridor and accepted the call. His mother's face appeared on his personal display, and for a moment, Jiwon forgot he was a cadet and a soldier, and just felt relief at seeing her. Admiral Hana Park looked older than he remembered, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and sleepless nights. Behind her he could see the bridge of a warship, busy with activity. "Mom," he said, and hated how young his voice sounded. "Jiwon." Her expression softened for just a moment before returning to military professionalism. "I have been following your progress at the academy. The instructor's reports have been interesting reading." "The gate incident," he said, feeling shame heat his face. "Made you famous?" she interrupted. "Not just at the academy, but across Union space. Every species now knows that humans are predators, that we have the capacity for violence they can barely imagine. Some are terrified. Others are angry. But most are simply confused about what it means." She paused. "I am calling to tell you that Earth is sending ships. The first human war fleet in 300 years is en route to Theta Carini. We will arrive in 48 hours. Jiwon felt his chest tighten with emotion he could not name. "Earth is joining the fight?" "We have to," Hana said simply. "The Union accepted us despite their fears. They gave us the stars when they could have left us isolated on Earth forever. Now they need us, and we will not abandon them. Besides," and here she smiled grimly, "if the Yoth are truly back, this is everyone's fight. Earth included. What do you need me to do?" Jiwon asked. "Survive," Hana said, "and keep those alien cadets alive if you can. They are going to be scared, Jiwon. They are prey species facing their evolutionary nightmares, and their every instinct will be screaming at them to run. You need to show them that predators can be beaten, that courage matters, that fighting back is possible. Can you do that?" "Yes," Jiwon said without hesitation. Hana nodded. "Good. One more thing, I'm sending someone to the academy, a specialist who fought in the Outer Colony Wars. She will arrive before your deployment and will help train any cadets willing to learn human combat doctrine. Her name is Minji Choi, and she has forgotten more about war than most beings will ever know. Listen to her." The connection started to break up as Hana's ship moved out of comm range. Her last words came through fragmented. "Love you, son. Come home safe." "Love you too, Mom," Jiwon said to the empty channel. He made his way to the deployment bay where organized chaos reigned. Cadets were drawing weapons and armor, checking equipment and boarding small transport craft that would take them to the warships gathering in orbit. Jiwon collected his gear and found his assigned squad. Keltar, Pris, Pros, Vess, and 2 other cadets he had trained with over the past weeks. They looked at him with expressions that held fear but also determination. "Stay together," Jiwon told them. "Watch each other's backs. Remember what we practiced. And if we encounter the Yoth?" Keltar asked quietly. "Then we show them that prey species with predator training are more dangerous than they remember," Jiwon answered. A commotion at the bay entrance made everyone turn. A shuttle was docking, unscheduled, and broadcasting Earth military codes. The airlock opened and a woman stepped out, short and compact with muscle, her face marked by scars that told stories of battles survived. She wore Earth Defense Force armor and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had walked through hell and come out the other side. "Which one of you is Cadet Jiwon Park?" she called out, her voice carrying across the bay. "Here," Jiwon answered, stepping forward. The woman looked him up and down, then smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator. "Master Sergeant Minji Choi," she said. The Battle of Theta Carini began with silence, which was somehow worse than any sound could have been. Jiwon watched from the observation port of the Union cruiser, as Yoth warships tore through the defensive drones like a predator through paper. their weapons moving with deadly precision that spoke of 300 years spent preparing for this moment. The automated defenses that had protected the galaxy for centuries lasted less than 10 minutes before being reduced to debris and expanding clouds of gas. "They are so fast," Vess whispered through her vocoder, her gaseous form swirling with agitation inside her containment suit. Around them, other cadets watched in growing horror as the Yoth demonstrated why they had nearly conquered the galaxy once before. These were not the mindless monsters from ancient recordings. These were evolved warriors, adapted and improved, and they moved through Union formations with terrifying efficiency. The Union fleet tried to respond with standard doctrine: maintain distance, coordinate drone swarms, overwhelm the enemy with numbers and firepower from safe range. It was logical and proven, and based on millions of years of prey species survival instinct. It was also completely ineffective. The Yoth had spent 3 centuries studying Union tactics, and they had learned. They closed distance impossibly fast, their ships accelerating in ways that should have torn them apart but somehow did not. They targeted the drone control vessels first, cutting the head from the snake, and without their automated support, the Union ships floundered. A Yoth boarding party hit the cruiser's hull with a sound like thunder, and alarms screamed throughout the ship. Jiwan felt the impact through his boots and his training kicked in before conscious thought could interfere. "Seal the forward sections," he ordered his squad. "Standard boarding defense, establish choke points and fall back to—" "No," Keltar interrupted, and there was something fierce in his voice that Jiwan had never heard before. "That is prey thinking. We do not fall back. We hunt them on our ship. You taught us this." Jiwan looked at the Drax and saw not the arrogant cadet who had mocked him months ago, but a warrior who had learned to think like a predator. Around them, Pris and Pross chimed in agreement, their crystalline bodies glowing with determination. Other cadets were nodding, faces set with resolve despite the fear in their eyes. "Minji's way," Vess said simply. "Minji's way," Jiwan agreed, and felt pride surge through him. They had learned. They had adapted. Now it was time to show the Yoth what happened when prey species learned to hunt back. The Yoth breached through the hull 20 meters from their position, and Jiwan got his first real look at the enemy that haunted galactic nightmares. They were massive, easily twice his height, covered in armor plates that looked organic and technological at the same time. Their limbs ended in claws that could tear through steel, and their eyes held intelligence that was somehow more terrifying than pure animal rage. They moved into the corridor expecting scattered resistance and easy prey. They got Jiwan instead. He did not hesitate, did not wait for optimal conditions, did not calculate probability of success. He simply moved forward with his squad behind him, closing the distance that every Union doctrine said to maintain, getting inside the reach of those terrible claws where human close-quarters training could turn size into a disadvantage. His blade found the joint between armor plates that Minji had made them memorize, and the first Yoth went down with a roar of surprise. Keltar was beside him, using the Drax speed and agility in ways his species had never considered, striking at weak points rather than engaging in the ritualized combat of his culture. Pris and Pross moved as a unit, their crystalline bodies refracting energy weapon fire back at the Yoth while their smaller size let them slip through defenses. Vess used her gaseous form to blind and confuse, flowing through the Yoth formation like poison smoke. The Yoth had expected frightened prey. They encountered coordinated predators and confusion rippled through their ranks. More boarding parties hit the ship, but Jiwan's squad was not alone. Throughout the cruiser, cadets who had trained under Minji's brutal lessons were applying human combat doctrine. They did not fall back. They did not scatter. They hunted the hunters on their own ship. And the Yoth were learning that 300 years of preparation had not included fighting against prey that refused to run. The battle shifted when the Earth fleet arrived. Jiwan heard them before he saw them, their arrival announced by comm channels suddenly alive with human voices using military jargon that sounded like music to his ears. "Earth Defense Force entering engagement range," came his mother's voice across all frequencies. "All Union vessels, this is Admiral Hana Park. We are here to help. Let us show them what happens when you wake up a sleeping predator." Human ships did not fight like Union vessels. They did not maintain distance or rely on drones. They closed to point-blank range, their hulls actually scraping against Yoth warships as they deployed boarding parties directly into enemy vessels. It was insane by Union standards, but it worked because humans understood something the prey species had never fully grasped. Sometimes the only way to beat a predator was to be a bigger, meaner predator. G1's squad fought through 3 more boarding parties before the tide finally turned. The last Yoth warrior they faced was different from the others, larger and covered in decorations that suggested rank or honor. It stood in the corridor blocking their path to the ship's command center, and when it spoke, the translator converted its growling language into words. "You are not prey," it said, studying them with eyes that held grudging respect. "You fight like Yoth. What are you?" "Prey that learned to hunt," G1 answered, and he did not lower his weapon. The Yoth warrior made a sound that might have been laughter. "Interesting. 300 years we prepared to face the old prey species. We did not prepare for new ones." It raised its claws in a gesture that looked like surrender. "This battle is yours, but the war continues. We will adapt again." "So will we," Keltar said, stepping forward beside G1. "And next time, we will be ready." The Yoth warrior nodded once, then collapsed as stun weapons from Union security finally caught up with the fight. G1 let his weapon lower and realized he was shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with action. Around him, his squad looked battered and exhausted but alive, all of them alive, and that felt like the greatest victory possible. The Battle of Theta Carinae ended 8 hours after it began. The Yoth withdrew back through their spatial rift, their fleet reduced by 40% and their confidence in an easy victory shattered. Union losses were heavy, dozens of ships destroyed and thousands of beings dead, but it could have been so much worse. It should have been worse. That it was not came down to one simple fact. Humans had taught prey species how to fight like predators, and that made all the difference. 3 days later, G1 stood in the academy briefing hall with his squad, exhausted and still processing everything they had survived. Instructor Rallis stood before them with other academy officials and representatives from the Union Council. The room was filled with cadets and instructors, but this time when they looked at G1, the fear was gone, replaced by something that looked like respect. "The council has reached a decision," a council member said, a Velen elder whose crystalline body showed the clouding of age. "Humanity has proven itself in battle. You are granted full military status within the Galactic Union, effective immediately. Your tactics, your training methods, your way of war will be integrated into Union defense doctrine. We need humans on the front lines. We need human instructors training our soldiers. We need your perspective to balance our own. We were wrong about your species," another council member added, a Drax with scales that bore the scars of the old Yoth wars. "We saw the gate go red and thought it meant you were monsters. We understand now that it meant you were survivors, warriors, beings who refuse to surrender even when every logical calculation says you should. That is not monstrosity. That is courage." Rallis stepped forward and looked directly at G1. "You are the first human to attend this academy. You will not be the last. Applications from Earth have already begun arriving. Hundreds of them. The Union wants human cadets, human officers, human warriors integrated into every level of our military. Will you help us train them?" G1 glanced at his squad, at Keltar, who had become more than a roommate, at Pris and Pros and Vess, who had trusted a predator species enough to learn their ways. He thought about the Yoth warrior's words, about adaptation and the ongoing war. He thought about his mother commanding Earth's warships and Minji teaching aliens how to hunt. He thought about the gate going red and all the fear and prejudice that had followed, and how they had overcome it together. "Yes," he said, "we will help." Keltar stepped forward and placed a clawed hand on G1's shoulder. "We were afraid of humans because we did not understand you. We thought predators could only destroy. You showed us that predators can also protect. You taught us that evolution does not determine destiny. We chose to be afraid before. Now we choose to be allies." "Friends," G1 corrected gently. "Friends," Keltar agreed, and his voice held warmth that transcended species differences. The chamber floated in space above a world that belonged to no one, and inside that chamber sat representatives from 12 different species, who had learned long ago that talking prevented dying. And Daehyun Kim sat among them wearing the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, while his aide, Jiwoo Park, stood behind him with a tablet full of numbers and treaties that nobody would read today because something unprecedented was happening. something that made even the ancient species shift uncomfortably in their seats and whisper among themselves in languages that sounded like wind through crystals or drums in deep water, and that something was the arrival of the Vorlathi, who never left their homeworld anymore, who had stopped caring about galactic politics 3,000 years ago, when they developed the ability to see through time itself and realized that most of what happens doesn't matter in the long run. But apparently something mattered now because their ship had appeared without warning and requested an emergency session. And now Daehyun watched as the doors opened and 3 figures entered, who looked almost human, except their eyes were too large and completely black like pools of ink. And they moved with the careful deliberation of people who had already seen this moment 1,000 times and were simply going through the motions of making it real. The eldest of the 3 Vorlathi was named Thessian, according to the translation matrix, though Jiwoo whispered that the actual name took 17 syllables and referenced a star that had died before humans discovered fire, and Thessian walked to the center of the circular chamber where a platform waited for speakers, and every representative leaned forward because the Vorlathi had not addressed the council in living memory. Not even when the Krell had tried to claim the mineral-rich asteroid fields near Vorlathi space, not even when the Great Plague swept through 4 systems and killed billions, not even when humanity had first arrived in faster-than-light ships and demanded recognition as a spacefaring species. So whatever brought them here today carried weight that made planets feel light. Thessian spoke in a voice that bypassed the translation matrix entirely and simply appeared in everyone's mind like a memory they had always possessed, saying that he had seen the threads of fate converging on a point that would reshape the galaxy, that he had watched futures branch and collapse and reform around a single event that approached with mathematical certainty, that the youngest species sat in danger so profound that even 3,000 years of careful neutrality could not prevent him from speaking. And Daehyun felt his stomach tighten because he understood immediately that youngest species meant humanity, meant Earth, meant the colonies that now stretched across 17 systems and held 6 billion human souls who thought they were safe under the Council's protection. The Krell ambassador rose from his seat making sounds like grinding stones, his forearms gesturing in what the translation matrix labeled as emphatic denial before accusation is made. But Thessian simply turned those black eyes toward the insectoid diplomat and continued speaking, saying that the Krell Dominion had already decided to strike at humanity's agricultural colony, called New Sol, that 47 warships were already being supplied and crewed, that the attack would come within 30 standard rotations, that 2 million humans would die in fire from orbit, because the Krell High Command believed that humanity's rapid technological advancement threatened the established order of species, who had held power for millennia, and the chamber erupted into chaos with half the representatives shouting for proof, while the other half demanded immediate investigation. And through it all, Daehyun sat perfectly still because his military training taught him to recognize truth, delivered without emotion. And everything in Thessian's voice carried the flat certainty of someone reporting history, rather than prediction. The Krell ambassador was screaming now about ancient laws against precognitive testimony, about how the Vorlathi had no evidence beyond visions that could mean anything, about how this insult would not stand unanswered. And Daehyun noted with cold precision that the ambassador never actually denied the accusation, never said we would never attack New Sol, never offered to allow inspectors into Krell space, and that omission told him everything he needed to know about what waited in the darkness between stars. But then Thessian did something that changed everything. Turning away from the council to look directly at Daehyun with those eyes that had seen futures collapse into present moments. And when he spoke again, his words bypassed the translation entirely and arrived in Daehyun's mind with the force of prophecy. Human, hear my warning well, because your species does not yet understand its own nature, and that ignorance will shape everything that follows, Thessian said inside Daehyun's thoughts while the council chamber faded to insignificance around them. I have seen 17,000 futures that branch from this moment, and in all but 7 of them your colony burns. But what happens after varies wildly depending on a single choice that you will make in the next 30 days. And that choice is whether humanity strikes first against the Krell before they can launch their attack. Daehyun wanted to ask obvious questions about preemptive strikes and defensive war and proportional response. But Thessian continued speaking with the patience of someone who had already heard every question and answer, saying, if you strike first, if you send your fleets to Krell space before they attack, If you destroy their ships while they sit in dock preparing for war, then something will awaken in your species that has slept since you left your homeworld, and you will not stop. Not when the Krell surrender, not when the Council demands peace, not until every Krell world is ash or until humanity exhausts itself in a war that consumes generations. Because humans possess a capacity for sustained total warfare that even you do not comprehend. A refusal to accept defeat that borders on insanity from the perspective of every other species. And if that capacity awakens through offensive action rather than defense, it will burn through the galaxy like fire through dry timber. The vision released Daehyun back into the council chamber where only seconds had passed, where Jiwoo still stood behind him unaware that he had just received prophecy, where the Krell ambassador continued demanding that the Vorlathi be censured for their interference, and Daehyun raised his hand for recognition and waited for the chamber to quiet before speaking in the measured tones that had carried him through 3 decades of military service and 2 decades of diplomatic posting, saying that Earth would of course cooperate with any council investigation, that humanity welcomed inspectors to verify the Krell's peaceful intentions, that surely this misunderstanding could be resolved through established channels, and he watched the other ambassadors nod approvingly at his reasonable response while inside his mind he was already calculating defense, deployments and fleet movements and wondering if 30 days would be enough time to evacuate 2 million civilians. Queer. The session ended. Jiwoo followed him through corridors that curved with the station's rotation, asking questions that he only half heard about protocol and response options, and whether they should contact Earth immediately. And finally he stopped and turned to face her and saw in her young, idealistic face everything that humanity wanted to believe about itself. That they were peaceful, that they played by rules, that violence was always the last resort. And he realized that Thessian had seen something in human nature that humans themselves had not yet confronted. Something that slept in their genes like a coiled spring waiting for the right pressure to release. "Contact Admiral Minho," Daehyun said quietly while station traffic flowed around them like water around stones. "Tell him to quietly reinforce New Seoul's defenses but make it look like a routine rotation, and get higher and to start monitoring all Krell communication channels for any signs of fleet movement. And do it all through back channels because if the Council thinks we're preparing for war, they'll tie us up in committees until it's too late." Jiwoo's face showed confusion mixed with fear because she had joined diplomatic service to prevent wars, not prepare for them. And she asked the question that would haunt them both in the months to come, asking, "Do you really believe the Vorlathi? Do you think the Krell would actually attack us without provocation?" And Daehyun thought about Thessian's black eyes that had seen 17,000 futures, thought about the Krell ambassador who never denied the accusation, thought about the hard truth that species who had ruled for millennia might see humanity's growth as threat rather than promise, and he answered with the only honesty that mattered. "I believe that if we're wrong, we waste some resources on extra defenses. But if we're right and do nothing, 2 million people die. And I'm not willing to take that bet," he said, and then walked toward the communication center to begin making calls that would either save a colony or start humanity down a path that even a 3,000-year-old prophet feared to fully describe. Sun Wuhan stood on the observation deck of New Seoul's Central Administration Tower, watching the third moon rise over endless fields of engineered wheat that fed 40 human worlds, and his daughter Minji pressed her face against the transparent aluminum, asking if the pretty lights in orbit were more supply ships, and he smiled without answering. Because those lights were Admiral Minho's reinforcement fleet that had arrived 3 days ago under the pretense of routine exercises, and his wife Yujin gave him that look she always gave when he kept secrets for everyone's good. The look that said she knew something was wrong but trusted him to handle it, and he wished desperately that he could evacuate everyone right now, load every ship with civilians and send them to safety. But Daehyun's orders had been explicit. No mass evacuation because that would confirm suspicions and potentially trigger the attack they hoped to prevent. So instead they had quietly staged emergency supplies, pre-positioned evacuation shuttles, and increased the shield generator output to maximum sustainable levels while telling everyone it was just maintenance and drills. Captain Yuna, Song sat in the command chair of the patrol ship Defender running diagnostics for the 4th. Time that shift because idle hands made her nervous, and something in the Admiral's briefing yesterday had carried undertones that made every instinct she had developed over 15 years of service scream warnings into the void, and her tactical officer Kyung-hee kept glancing at the long-range sensors with the intensity of someone expecting ghosts. And maybe they both were crazy. Maybe the stress of enhanced readiness drills was making them see threats in empty space. But then the sensor board lit up with contact signatures that materialized from hyperspace in a formation that no merchant convoy would ever use, and Yuna's training took over before conscious thought could interfere. Her hand slapping the general alarm while her voice carried across all frequencies saying, "Hostile contacts, all ships to battle stations. This is not a drill." 50 Krell warships dropped into normal space at the system's edge in a formation designed for planetary assault, and their transponders broadcast nothing. No identification codes, no hailing frequencies, just the electromagnetic silence of predators who had already decided their prey was dead. And aboard the lead Krell vessel, the fleet commander, whose name, translated roughly to "stone that crushes," reviewed targeting data for New Sol's population centers with the satisfaction of someone performing a necessary task. Because the humans had to learn their place, had to understand that species who evolved yesterday did not dictate terms to civilizations that had ruled for millennia, and if teaching that lesson required killing a few million primitives, then such was the price of maintaining. Order Yuna's 8 patrol ships accelerated toward the Krell fleet, knowing that mathematics made their survival impossible, but also knowing that every minute they bought was another 1,000 civilians reaching evacuation shuttles. And she opened a channel to her small squadron saying, "Today we find out what we're made of. Make every shot count. Make them pay for every meter. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll slow them down enough for the civilians to get clear." And then there was no more time for words because the Krell fleet had launched missiles that turned space into a geometry problem where the only solution was death. Ji-hoon Kang ran through the underground maintenance tunnels toward Generator Station 3, where alarms screamed that the shield grid was already taking hits from long-range Krell bombardment, and his assistant Borum shouted over the noise that the system was never designed for this kind of sustained fire, that the capacitors would overload in 17 minutes at current draw, and Ji-hoon started rerouting power from the residential sectors because dead civilians didn't need electricity, while living ones desperately needed shields. And his hands moved across the control interface with the precision of 20 years maintaining these generators, bypassing safety protocols that existed to prevent exactly what he was doing, pushing the system past rated capacity into the red zone where equipment either performed miracles or exploded. Admiral Minho watched the tactical display aboard his flagship Indomitable, while his fleet of 30 warships accelerated toward New Sol at maximum burn, knowing they would arrive too late, knowing that Yuna's patrol squadron was already dying to buy time he couldn't give back, and his tactical officer Commander Taejin reported that the Krell had committed their entire assault fleet, which meant they intended to make New Sol a lesson written in fire, and Minho gave orders to prepare for fleet engagement while simultaneously directing every transport within 3 systems to converge on New Sol for evacuation because if they couldn't prevent the attack, maybe they could at least save some of the people. Sun Wu evacuated the administration tower when the first kinetic strikes hit the northern continent, herding his family into a shuttle that was already overloaded with terrified colonists who pressed against each other, while children cried and adults tried to maintain calm through expressions that fooled nobody. And Eugen held Minji close while asking where the defense fleet was, why nobody was stopping this, and Sun Wu explained through a throat tight with fear that Captain Yuna's squadron was buying them time, that Admiral Minho was coming, that they just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. And then the shuttle lifted off, and through the viewport he watched his city, the place where he had served as administrator for 12 years, the place where Minji had been born, the place that 4 million people called home, and he watched it burn. Yuna's ship defender died with honor, taking a Krell destroyer with it. Her final act ramming the damaged enemy vessel after her weapons ran dry, and her engines screamed past safety limits. And her last transmission reached every ship in the system saying, "Tell Earth they were right, the monsters are real. Make them pay for this." And then there was light and heat and the mathematical certainty of hull breach at combat velocity. And of her original squadron of 8 patrol ships, only 2 remained operational, while the Krell fleet advanced toward New Sol with barely diminished strength. The shields held for 17 minutes exactly as Ji-hoon had calculated before the generators overheated, beyond any possibility of recovery. And in those 17 minutes, 60% of New Sol's population reached evacuation shuttles or emergency bunkers, which meant approximately 2,400,000 civilians still remained exposed when the shields collapsed and Krell kinetic bombardment began in earnest. And Jihoon stayed at his post trying to restore power, refusing evacuation, working until the administration tower took a direct hit and 1,700 tons of orbital debris traveling at 40,000 kilometers per hour converted his body and Borum's body and everything they had tried to save into superheated plasma. Admiral Minho's fleet arrived to find New Sol burning from pole to pole. The Krell fleet already withdrawing toward hyperspace jump points, and his tactical officer reported 2,400,000 confirmed casualties with numbers still rising, as search and rescue penetrated the devastation, and Minho gave orders to pursue the Krell fleet, knowing they would escape but needing to do something other than watch his failures scroll across the damage reports. And then his communication officer received a priority transmission from the Krell fleet. A single message buoy left behind like an insult carved into a grave marker. The message played on the Indomitable's bridge in the grinding stone voice of Krell Command saying, "This is the price of expansion. Remain within your designated space or more colonies will burn. Humanity has been warned," and then it self-destructed, and Commander Tajin asked quietly what their orders were. Whether they should return to Earth, whether they should begin search and rescue, and Admiral Minho looked at the tactical display showing New Sol's ruined surface and felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest, something that had slept through 30 years of military service, and he realized with perfect clarity what the Vorlothi prophet had tried to warn them about. Sunwoo's shuttle reached orbit to find Admiral Minho's fleet forming up for system defense, and through the viewport he could see New Sol burning below, see the scars where kinetic strikes had carved canyons into continents, see the cities he had administered reduced to craters still glowing with residual heat. And Minji asked why the planet looked different, why everything was red, and he had no answer that a 7-year-old could understand. No way to explain that her home was gone, that her school was gone, that 2 million people, including her best friend's family, were gone. And Eugen wept silently while holding their daughter close. And all around them in the crowded shuttle, other families confronted the same loss. The news reached Earth 3 hours later, traveling through quantum-entangled communication relays that connected all human worlds. And Daehyun received it in the council chambers where he had been arguing for sanctions against the Krell. And he read the casualty estimates and the refugee counts and the message the Krell had left behind. And something in his expression made the other ambassadors stop talking, made Jiwoo reach for his arm in concern, made even the Krell ambassador shift. Earth's War Council convened in Geneva 3 days after New Sol burned, and every member arrived already knowing what decision they would make, because the images from the refugee ships had played on every screen across every human world. Images of Sunwoo holding his daughter while she asked when they could go home. Images of the mass graves being dug on the evacuation stations. Images of the scars carved into New Sol's surface visible from orbit. And Fleet Commander Hajun Nam presented the military's recommendation, which was simple enough that even civilians could understand. Complete dismantling of Krell military capability across all 40 of their star systems, and when the civilian oversight representative asked about proportional response, Hajun replied that proportionality died with 2,400,000 colonists. Galactic Council expected humanity to follow established patterns because that's what civilized species did when attacked. They would file formal complaints, present evidence to the tribunal, accept mediation, and eventually receive reparations or sanctions against the aggressor. And the whole process would take years while diplomats argued about precedent and jurisdiction and appropriate penalties. But what the council didn't understand was that humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting warfare in an environment where losing meant extinction, where every conflict carried existential stakes, where the only species available to fight was each other, and that kind of evolutionary pressure created something unique in the galaxy. Something the Krell were about to discover. Commander Hajun's first fleet hit the Krell industrial world of Torvax 7, 6 days after New Sol burned. Not with a surgical strike designed to minimize casualties, not with warnings or demands for surrender, but with a systematic bombardment of every shipyard, every weapons facility, every manufacturing center capable of producing military hardware. And when the Krell garrison tried to engage, they found human warships that fought with a coordination born from centuries of total war against themselves. Ships that used tactics developed in conflicts where losing meant your entire civilization disappeared. and the battle lasted 3 hours before the Krell defenders broke and ran, while Hajun's fleet completed their mission of turning Torvax 7's military infrastructure into radioactive craters general. Soman Yoon's Marines landed on the Krell fortress world of Drak 9 not to occupy but to demonstrate, dropping from orbit in assault pods that carved through defensive fire with the inevitability of mathematics. And her troops moved through Krell defensive positions with a precision that terrified the defenders, because humans fought like they expected to die but refused to stop. And when the fortress commander finally surrendered expecting execution or enslavement, Soman's response shocked him more than defeat. She offered medical care for wounded Krell soldiers and guaranteed safety for civilians while her engineers systematically demolished every weapons battery and military installation. And the fortress commander asked why humans showed mercy after New Sol. And Soman replied, "We're not here to kill Krell. We're here to make sure you can never kill us." The Krell High Command ordered their main fleet to engage the human invaders, expecting a conventional fleet battle where superior numbers would prevail. But Commander Hajun refused to fight on Krell terms. Instead, his ships scattered across multiple systems, forcing the Krell to divide their forces. And every time the Krell concentrated for battle, the human fleet withdrew. But every time the Krell moved to protect their industrial worlds, human ships appeared and destroyed another shipyard, another weapons factory, another supply depot. And after 2 months of this, the Krell fleet was still intact, but their ability to replace losses was being systematically erased. Taewon Park sat in a communication center on the human carrier Relentless, composing messages that would reach every Krell world through channels that bypassed their government censorship. And his broadcasts were masterpieces of psychological warfare, saying, "Your leaders chose this war when they burned New Sol. Every factory we destroy is their choice. Every shipyard we disable is their choice. And we will keep coming until they cannot threaten anyone again. But your civilians are safe. Your homes are safe. Your children are safe if you don't fight, because we're not the Krell. We don't murder civilians from orbit." And the effect was exactly what he calculated. Krell worlds began questioning their government, began asking why they should die for leaders who started a war by massacring human colonists. Correspondent Yoonji Cho traveled with the Third Fleet, sending reports back to Earth and the galactic networks, showing the reality of the human offensive. And what she showed was not the genocide that Council species feared, but something almost more disturbing. A species that fought with absolute determination while maintaining precise control. Marines who would die holding defensive positions but never fired on civilians. Fleet commanders who destroyed military targets with surgical precision while avoiding population centers. And engineers who arrived behind the combat troops to help rebuild civilian infrastructure, even as the war continued. And her reports forced the galaxy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity wasn't becoming the monsters. They were becoming something worse for their enemies. They were becoming unstoppable. The Krell sued for peace after 6 months, offering territorial concessions and reparations, and the Galactic Council rushed to mediate, expecting humanity would accept, because 6 months of warfare had cost Earth's economy dearly, and public support for continued fighting was surely weakening. But Ambassador Daehyun's response reached the council chambers with all the warmth of vacuum, saying the Krell will surrender completely and accept full dismantling of their military capability, or we will continue operations indefinitely. And the council representative tried to argue that such terms were unreasonable, that the Krell had suffered enough, that continuing the war served no purpose. And Daehyun replied, "You said the same thing after New Sol burned, that we had suffered enough, that seeking justice served no purpose. Where was the council when 2 million humans died? Where was galactic law when the Krell attacked without provocation? And now that we're winning, you suddenly care about proportionality?" General Soman's Marines pushed deeper into Krell space, taking one fortress world after another, and the pattern was always the same. Fierce resistance followed by surrender, followed by humane treatment and systematic dismantling of military infrastructure. And Krell soldiers began surrendering more quickly because they learned that humans kept their promises, that wounded prisoners received medical care, that civilians were protected, that the humans were serious about only destroying military capability. And this somehow made the defeats worse, because the Krell had expected barbarians who could be fought with barbarian tactics. But instead they faced an enemy who fought with precision and mercy in equal measure. Commander Haijun's fleet reached the Krell core systems. After 8 months and the defenders fought, desperately because these were the heart worlds, where Krell civilization had been born, and the battles were fierce with both sides taking heavy casualties. But the mathematics were inevitable. Humans had mobilized their economy for total war, while the Krell industrial base was already shattered. Humans could replace ships and crews while the Krell could not. And most importantly, humans showed no sign of stopping. No war weariness, no protest demanding peace. Just a grinding determination to finish what had been started. The Krell attempted one desperate gamble, organizing their remaining fleet for a strike against Earth itself, hoping to make humans feel the same terror that New Sol had experienced, hoping to break the will that seemed unbreakable, and they gathered every operational warship from every system, more than 200 vessels, and they jumped toward the Sol system, believing that surely humanity would negotiate if their homeworld was threatened. But they didn't understand that threatening Earth wouldn't make humans stop. It would make them angry. And angry humans were already dismantling the Krell Empire world. By World Admiral Minho commanded the Sol System Defense Fleet, and his sensors detected the Krell task force when it entered the outer system. And he had been waiting for this, knowing it would come, knowing that cornered enemies always struck at what they thought was weakness, and his fleet moved to intercept with the cold efficiency of people defending their home. And the battle lasted 7 hours, with the Krell throwing everything they had against Earth's defenses. And when it was over, not a single Krell ship escaped. Every vessel was destroyed or disabled. And Minho broadcast images of the wreckage to every Krell world, saying, "You tried to make us feel what you made New Sol feel. Instead, you've demonstrated why you can never win this war." Taewon's psychological warfare reached its peak after the failed Earth assault. His broadcast to Krell worlds showing the destroyed task force, showing the futility of continued resistance, saying your government has now lost over 400 warships trying to fight humanity. Your industrial base is shattered. Your colonies are undefended, and we're still coming. Every day we come. Every day we take another system, another shipyard, another fortress, and we will never stop until you cannot threaten anyone again. And Krell morale collapsed across entire sectors.